Hello to everyone who's watching this. This is my 38th video on the channel, and today we're looking at Jean-François Lyotard's concept of the libidinal band, developed in his 1974 book Libidinal Economy. This is a bit different from a lot of my other videos, and a lot longer, so apologies if it's a bit rough. I hope to start making some more of these sort of term-based videos, where I look closely at a certain idea. If you all would be interested in such content, please let me know in the comments. As a last couple disclaimers, I just want to note that I am by no means a Lyotard expert, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. There are unfortunately very few resources available concerning the libidinal band, but I've compiled a list of sources I'm using for this video in the description below. If I say anything wrong, be it about the band itself or Freud's libido theory, please let me know in the comments. Additionally, although I'll be citing the standard edition in the description for Freud, I've made quite a few alterations in translation for clarity's sake, for example using drive instead of instinct. I've also translated the quotes from Lyotard's non-libidinal economy works myself, since I can't seem to find any existing English versions. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Libidinal Economy is a unique book, to say the least. In some regards, it can be considered almost as a work of body horror, opening as it does with the flaying and complete dissection of a human body. However, there is a method to Lyotard's madness. More than simply being grotesque, his vivid description of the body's disassembly illustrates many of the band's central features. From the nature of desire's investment, what is usually called cathexis in psychoanalysis, to its topological characteristics. In this section, I'd like to examine these very features, particularly as they relate to the work of Sigmund Freud and his theories surrounding libido, the primary processes, and the drives. However, before we get ahead of ourselves, it would be well worth it to have at least a provisional definition of the libidinal band handy. Essentially, Lyotard developed the notion as a way to think about the real, that inaccessible material realm that underlies and is covered up by representation. For him, the band is first and foremost a useful fiction. Despite the real being impossible to think about through representation, the concept allows him to essentially create a framework to examine the role of desire or libido as it relates to all sorts of structures, from the political to the economic. Concerning its very basic aspects, it's populated by a myriad of what Lyotard calls intensities, excitations of desire that move infinitely quickly across the band. As can be seen in this diagram, this movement is aleatory and white-hot. In other words, it's completely random or chaotic, intensities traversing it in all directions at breakneck speeds. The band itself is also never still, instead being described by Lyotard as constantly spinning. Moving on to its makeup, he underlines again and again its heterogeneity. As he himself puts it,
"It is made from the most heterogeneous textures, bone, epithelium, sheets to write on, charged atmospheres, swords, glass cases, peoples, grasses, canvases to paint."
In other words, as we'll soon see, desire is invested unconditionally on the band. Everything is engaged, not just this or that erogenous zone. This is where the opening dissection is important. By laying out the body in its totality and connecting it without borders to what is usually thought of as its surroundings, Lyotard establishes the band as the ultimate embodiment of what Freud terms a polymorphous perversity, a form of sexuality that can achieve gratification from essentially anything, free from social norms. In Lyotard's words,
"We must perform the dissection of polymorphous perversity, spread out the immense membrane of the libidinal body, which is quite different to a frame."
This polymorphous perversity is completely plastic, cathecting anything and everything that it possibly can. It's perverse because it goes against what is considered normal or good, although not in the sense of transgressing something. It simply is, unrestrained and non-representative, as Lyotard says. As to this point, some background on what exactly libido is would probably be quite helpful. Essentially, in Freud's work, the term refers to a specifically sexual energy that can be invested or cathected by individuals in the objects around them. This energy is a driving force behind the functioning of the mind, organizing thought, behavior, and what have you. Concerning its origin, libido comes from what Freud calls the drives. Despite lying at the heart of his theory of sexuality, these are quite a slippery concept to pin down, largely due to Freud's tendency to constantly tinker with his ideas. At its core, though, he defines the concept like so.
By drive is provisionally to be understood the psychical representative of an endosomatic, continuously flowing source of stimulation.
The psychical representative part is a point of contention, Freud seemingly abandoning it in his post-1915 work, but everything else stands. Drives are constantly releasing energy that always comes from inside the organism's body. This energy, libido, is experienced as tension, being released through cathexis. Going further, as Freud says,
we are now in a position to discuss certain terms which are used in reference to the concept of a drive. For example, its pressure, its aim, its object, and its source.
To focus just on the latter three, these refer to instances of gratification, the thing that gratification is obtained from, what produces the attention that guides the drives respectively. Looking at the second to last in particular, the object is incredibly flexible in Freud's eyes. What is cathected by the drives doesn't necessarily have any biological reason why, be either external or internal. In the beginning, the drives have no specific object. They are polymorphously perverse. It's only through socialization that they become fixated on specific objects. After laying down the basics of libido and drives, we can now diagram cathexis like so. Going back to the notion of desire being unconditionally invested upon the libidinal band, Lyotard's way of thinking about the real can be described as a patchwork of drives, each secreting and cathecting energy. It's for this reason that he sometimes calls it the pulsional skin, pulsion simply being the French translation for drive. Ending this part of the section, I would just like to look at how Lyotard uses Freud's libido theory. Essentially, he posits a monism of desire, heavily inspired by Nietzsche's will to power, where everything, not just what is conventionally thought of as sexual, is ontologically based in libido. In his eyes, this energy is purely positive, although it may not always seem like it. Alongside libido, Lyotard locates in Freud a form of desire based upon lack. Upon first glance, this might seem to contradict the claim of libidinal monism, but this second kind of desire is essentially nothing more than a derivative of the first. With this in mind, we can turn to another important feature of the band, its function as the locus of primary processes. This is a concept that was first sketched out by Freud in his 1895 paper Project for Scientific Psychology, and developed in the interpretation of dreams. To borrow from the former,
wishful cathexis carried to the point of hallucination, and a complete generation of unpleasure, involving a complete expenditure of defense, may be described as psychical primary processes.
To break down what he's saying here, wishes involve the memories of objects being recathected with libido, even when that object isn't physically present. When not kept in check, this cathexis is experienced as a hallucination, being registered as an actual perception when in fact nothing of the sort is true. However, wishes aren't the sole primary processes that exist. Rather, to put in broader terms, the primary processes simply refer to anything that involves libido functioning and flowing unrestrained, like in the case of hallucinations, where reality fails to keep desire reined in. The libidinal band, where intensities fly at infinite speeds, is basically a way for Lyotard to consider the primary processes in terms of a space, or more accurately, a surface. The transformation of libido into desire as lack thus corresponds to the secondary processes, on which Freud writes,
those processes which are only made possible by a good cathexis of the ego, and which represent a moderation of the primary processes, may be described as psychical secondary processes.
When it comes to Lyotard, the specifics of how the ego moderates the primary processes isn't all that important. However, understanding its general characteristics will undoubtedly help with what Lyotard calls theatrical volume and dispositifs. Essentially, the ego serves the role of reality checking. In the case of wishes, it basically makes sure that the object being cathected is actually there, so as to stop hallucination. How it does this is through what Freud calls inhibition, diverting libido away from where it would usually flow. In other words, it regulates what pathways are acceptable for desire to take. Going beyond the ego itself, society carries out a similar replacement of the primary processes by secondary ones. For example, Freud posits that children start out as polymorphously perverse. So-called normal sexuality is produced only through inhibition on the part of their parents or the people around them, their plastic libido being molded to fit into socially acceptable behaviors. This is okay, that isn't. Summarizing, we can use a diagram like this in order to picture the relationship between the two types of process. Going step by step, libido or psychical intensity is produced by the drives, existing as polymorphously perverse under the primary processes. Next, that intensity is mediated by the secondary processes, like inhibition, binding it and limiting what it can do. Moving on now to the structure of the libidinal band, Lyotard gives it a distinctly topological character.
Zones are joined end to end in a band which has no back to it, a Möbius band which interests us not because it is closed, but because it is one-sided.
This is essentially the end goal of opening pages of libidinal economy, to show how the diverse patchwork of drives that makes up the human body and all it connects to can be folded and twisted to create something with no inside and no outside. There are few features more fundamental to the band, its one-sidedness allowing for the unrestrained movement of libido upon its surface. To put it another way, as the embodiment of our primary processes, the purely polymorphously perverse band makes no distinction between the this and the not this, rather contains everything, libido given free rein to cathect all that comes across it. There is nothing that exists outside its one surface. Nothing is excluded or negated. Having now looked at the structure of the band, it's time to explore what inhabits it. In this section, I'd like to further examine the nature of intensities and introduce the concept of singularities, something often left out of discussions about the libidinal skin, but which I feel are very important to understanding its dynamics. Starting out with what we defined earlier as excitations of desire, Lyotard essentially takes the concept of psychical intensity from Freud and radicalizes it. For the latter, we can get a glimpse of what he means by the term in his essay on dreams.
The psychical intensity, significance, or effective potentiality of the thoughts that structure a dream is, as we further find, transformed into sensory vividness.
Basically, intensity is equivalent to quantities of libido, quantities that can vary in magnitude, which can have heterogeneous impacts on psychical activity, like different levels of vividness in dreams based on how heavily a certain thought is cathected. So far, so good, at least as far as Lyotard is concerned. However, problems are popping up when we turn to a footnote Freud writes in the interpretation of dreams.
Psychical intensity or value, or the degree of interest of an idea, is of course to be distinguished from sensory intensity, or the intensity of the image presented.
From this, we can extract a roundabout definition of intensity, as it exists in the psychical apparatus, as somehow willable, equivalent to what he discusses in the Project for Scientific Psychology as attention. For Lyotard, as represented in this diagram, this can be farther from the truth. Instead, alongside being unlimited in what it can cathect, libido as intensity isn't controllable in any sense. Rather, it's completely aleatory, or random. This takes us to the second main entity that inhabits the libidinal band, singularities. To explain them, I think it would be well worth it to take a small detour through the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, their notion of partial objects mirroring singularities quite nicely.
Desire constantly couples continuous flows and partial objects that are by nature fragmentary and fragmented.
In DNG's philosophy, desire doesn't deal with whole objects. Rather, it makes connections between bits and pieces. To borrow an example from Eugene Holland's Guide to Anti-Oedipus, when a child nurses whilst gazing at its mother's face, only those two connections are made. The breast and the face are all that are cathected. Nothing more, nothing less. An important feature of these partial objects is that they don't form complete wholes, at least not imminently. Instead, in a fashion very reminiscent of Lyotard himself, DNG says that whole objects only come into being through the mediation of repression, and more importantly for us, representation, what they call the body without organs, something very similar to the band. Showing back to the matter at hand, singularities for Lyotard function in the exact same way. They are fragments that can connect to the world in a myriad of diverse ways, and, just like partial objects, explicitly do not make up any so-called organic bodies. We can see this in one of his untranslated works, where Lyotard writes,
"There has never been anything but fragments of bodies, and there will never be a body, this wandering collection of singularities being the very affirmation of the non-body."
This all might sound a bit strange, given we obviously encounter seemingly complete objects all the time in our day-to-day lives. However, as can be seen in this diagram, these unities simply don't exist on the libidinal level. As we'll examine in a little while, the appearance of whole objects is a result of the secondary processes, only existing through the imposition of representation onto the libidinal band, much the same way as in D&G with their body without organs. With this, we can turn to the function of singularities on the libidinal band. Essentially, they are what are co-affected by intensities, which flow from one to the next infinitely quickly, never stopping long enough for any seemingly whole structure to develop. In Deleuze and Guattari's words,
partial objects are not representations of parental figures or of the basic patterns of family relations. They are parts of desiring machines.
To repurpose this quote in a way undoubtedly quite different from what D&G intended, we can think of the drives that act as the band's patchwork architecture as Lyotard's own desiring machines, releasing flows of libido that, rather than investing in fully formed objects like we diagrammed earlier, instead co-affect singularities. However, segueing us into the next section, as Lyotard says,
the plural, the collection of singularities. This is precisely what is repressed and suppressed by power, capital, the law of market value, personal identity.
At this point, we've outlined some of the features that make the libidinal band what it is. From its topological features to its inhabitants, we've seen in these last two sections how Lyotard uses the concept as a useful fiction to think about the real. However, so far our focus on the primary processes has led us to neglect the secondary ones. In other words, we haven't yet seen how the libidinal band gives rise to reality as we experience it. In this section, I'd like to tackle just that, examining what the French theorist terms dispositifs, what it means for the band to have a theatrical volume. Considering the former first, dispositifs are sometimes translated as apparatuses or setups. They essentially function through capturing intensities and singularities and channeling them into relatively stable structures of cathexis. Whilst left to their own devices, intensities move infinitely quickly and only co-affect to jump from one singularity to the other. However, dispositifs slow down their movement. In this way, they are closely connected to Freud's secondary processes, Lyotard characterizing them by saying,
the psychical dispositif supports itself by repressing a threatening overflow.
This overflow is one of libido, dispositifs basically acting as inhibitors to restrict what can be affected and what can't. In this way, Lyotard usually describes their function as disjunctive, creating the this, what's allowed to be invested in with intensity, and the not this, everything else. To give some concrete examples of the forms that dispositifs can take, both the sexual and the political stand out. Concerning the first, the most obvious from a psychoanalytic perspective, Freud's psychosexual stages can be thought of as corresponding to a series of dispositifs acting on the band that forms the child's body. As it passes through each stage, its polymorphous perversity gets more and more restricted, drives becoming fixated around certain objects, the breast, the anus, what have you. In the process, you have the creation of a this in the form of sexuality considered to be socially acceptable, and a not this under everything else, what Freud calls the perversions. However, it would be reductive to think about dispositifs only in terms of sexuality. As we went over earlier, libido plays a central role in Lyotard's ontology, not just as it relates to sex. Desire is in play everywhere. We can see this clearly in the functioning of a state. If the primary processes were to have their way, organization would be anarchic and likely quite violent, to be rather Hobbesian about it. The more aggressive forms desire can take would lead essentially to chaos. However, through certain dispositifs such as that of society as a whole, they are kept in check or inhibited. Again, we have a division between acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. This, not this. Yet, dispositifs are never stable. As Lyotard puts it,
our dispositif is thought to be a transformer of energy, but drive energy is internal. It exercises its pressure continually. In these conditions, the issue seems to be precarious.
Dispositifs are always repressing libido, trying to displace it into activities that don't threaten their existence, but regardless, more always keeps coming. As such, they're in quite the balancing act, always undergoing a struggle with the same things they require to exist, not being truly permanent or fully stable. Coming back now to the band itself, the primary processes and polymorphous perversity it represents is slowly divided up and covered over by dispositifs and their associated secondary processes. To set the stage, I'd like to quote directly from Libidinal Economy.
The turning bar slackens its pace. The mad aleatory movement which engenders the libidinal band is sufficiently checked so that the this and the not this, confused by its extremely high speed in all the points of the field, now distinct, are sometimes the this, sometimes the not this. Here it is, and now it's gone. Here it is, fort da.
The band, with its white-hot aleatory movement running at infinite speeds, is thus slowed and cooled by the insistence of dispositifs acting on its surface. This is what is represented in this diagram, the disjunctive power of libidinal setups breaking its continuous surface up into what Lyotard calls the bar. This forms a patchwork of its own, albeit in a slightly different sense than when compared to the drives of libidinal band. To go back to dispositifs, Lyotard sees them as a series of exclusions that enact something akin to a grid that sieves out certain feelings, words, and so on to create specific areas of cathexis, not unlike how the ego works through inhibition. These areas form the structure of a bar, although why this happens is far from clear.
Why does the movement of the bar slow down? We know nothing of this. There is no answering the question why, which implies precisely nihilism and thought.
The nihilistic side of dispositifs is what we'll explore in the next section of this episode, but for now, I would just like to talk about one last feature of the bar and dispositifs, the tendency to dissimulate the intensities and singularities that make them up. Few concepts are as fundamental to Lyotard's work as that of dissimulation, which essentially refers to a covering up of sorts. Basically, as dispositifs take hold and slow the band, they act to hide that they originated out of chaos, or perhaps more accurately, out of unrestrained desire. Libido, which they repress to form structures, is an existential threat. If they are unable, for whatever reason, to not keep it in check, it has the potential to blow them up to kingdom come. In the same way, intensities themselves also dissimulate dispositifs. As they flow across the band at infinite speeds, it seems impossible for them to ever slow down long enough to be cathected in the structures that engender the bar. In this way, there is a constant interplay between libido and dispositifs, where the one struggles to get the upper hand over the other. With this in mind, we can talk about one of the concepts most important to the bar, the notion of a theatrical volume. This is necessarily tied to the existence of a libidinal band, Lyotard himself saying,
The theatre comes with the concept. The bar stops turning. On the contrary, it circumscribes.
Essentially, like we saw earlier, the interplay between dispositifs and intensity give rise to a this that undergoes cathexis and a not this that is circumscribed or limited. Through this inhibition, there is basically the creation of an inside and an outside, where what can be called us is separated from them. This is what Lyotard means when he says that the bar has volume. Unlike the Möbius strip of a band, which is completely flat, there are now defined borders and separations. No longer can intensity just fly along it without ever stopping. Instead, libido is restrained to where it is and where it isn't. Concerning the theatrical part of it, Lyotard sees all dispositifs, all meta-narratives if you will, as essentially creating plays of libidinal intensity. Inside the bar, libido is treated like an actor playing a part. You with that desire do this, you with this do that, so on and so on. Every dispositif, through dissimulation, acts as if it's the be-all and end-all of reality, when in fact it's only staging a performance of desire. A clear example of this in action can be seen in the creation of organic bodies like we talked about earlier, seen as whole objects rather than mismatches of diverse singularities. To go back to the beginning pages of a book, just look at the human body.
A product which must constantly be produced through operations, manipulations, graphs, occlusions, and derivations performed upon the labyrinthine libidinal band.
For Lyotard, the skin is only a false frontier that separates the inside from the outside. Like we saw earlier in the first section of this episode, desire's libido is invested everywhere, unconditionally. It's simply a specific paradigm of power that says here's the body, here's everything else. Obviously, the skin exists. He isn't denying that. Rather, Lyotard is just arguing that how this body relates to desire and cathexis is the result of certain historical narratives, rather than some overarching transcendent truth. As you'll soon see, this notion of an organic body is perhaps more useful when considering things like Marxism and Capital, but for now what's important is that the theatre of a bar never fully appreciates the complexity of the singularities it engages. This connects directly back to what we ended the last part on, where we quoted Lyotard as saying,
The plural, the collection of singularities, This is precisely what is repressed and suppressed by power, capital, the law of market value, personal identity.
By minimizing the significance of singularities to be nothing more than parts of some sort of whole, Dispositifs and the theatrical volume they construct on the libidinal band fail to appreciate the dynamic and heterogeneous nature of the real, subjugating it under representation. Ending this section, I'd like to just say a few words about the spatial relationship between the libidinal band and the bar, particularly as it relates to Freud. Essentially, as we have just gone over, Dispositifs necessarily construct a distinction between the inside and the outside, the this and the not this. In this way, the flat one-sided band becomes 3D, a process that we can consider more concretely through the lens of psychoanalysis. As came up again and again in my research for this video, there's no original inner-outer division in Freud's work. In the beginning, organisms are unable to tell where they end and their surroundings begin. This is a state Lacan fittingly describes as real, usually in relation to a mythical mother-child unity. However, as organisms begin to engage with all the stimuli that come from existing in a world of violently moving masses, they need to learn how to protect themselves.
We have seen that the neuronal system is contrived in such a way that the major external quantities are held back from phi and even more from psi.
The first layer here, phi, refers to those neurons that accept external stimuli, albeit mediated by nerve endings. When it comes to psi, these are protected by a degree of impermeability, acting as memory neurons that store libido. At the beginning, there is no difference between the two systems. It's only through experience that they begin to form. With this in mind, we can say that the nervous system develops strata to defend itself from quantities of stimuli, intensities if you will. We can visualize this process like so, where phi filters out intensities that are too large so as to stop them from disturbing psi, which in turn protects another system, omega, defined as consciousness in Freud's late 19th century writings. This isn't exactly the cleanest reading of Freud, nor probably the clearest, but I hope it helps show how the filtering of stimuli produces the distinction. Connecting back to the libidinal band, it's very much like the organism prior to setting up these resistances. Intensities simply run across it, the complete unpleasure Freud associates with the primary processes ensuing. However, through dispositifs and thus the institution of secondary processes, a process of folding creates a similar set of filters between the band, or rather the bar, and what it develops into its outside. To maybe use a clear example, Freud says this in Drives and their Vicissitudes.
The perceptual substance of the living organism will have found in the efficacy of its muscular activity a basis for distinguishing between an outside and an inside.
Here, the division between inside and outside comes from a realization of a difference between the pressure exerted by libido and that of other sources. This has to be learnt. It doesn't just come with existing. So far, we've only really talked about dispositifs and the replacement of the band by the bar in quite abstract terms. In this section, I'd like to ground what we've been talking about in a more concrete example, that being Lyotard's analysis of Marxism. In the process, I hope that I'll be able to make his notion of theatrical volume a bit clearer. To begin with though, I'd like to talk about a specific, particularly insistent dispositif that exists on the libidinal band, the Great Zero. This, in Lyotard's eyes, is what constructs the theatre of a bar, folding the band as to create an inside and an outside. At the heart of the matter, the Great Zero is the name under which Lyotard lays transcendent forces of signification or representation. In his eyes, they are all nihilistic, in the sense that they necessarily imply a gap between the real and the represented, always deferring meaning somewhere else. To put this another way, things on the inside of a bar are defined by their relationship with the outside. To be more specific, with what they aren't. For example, in psychoanalysis, the Great Zero takes the guise of the phallus, individuals being defined by their being castrated. Marxism, as a meta-narrative, acts the exact same way. As can be seen in this diagram, it works through the creation of the this of a perfect communist world and the not this of a tainted capitalist one. The authentic form of production posited by this Marxist dispositif in turn defines society by what it isn't. That's to say, nihilistically by its lack. The Great Zero, such as it can be found in Marxism, essentially sets the stage for libidinal plays, folding the band as to create the space in which the secondary processes can properly check the primary ones. This isn't necessarily an attack on Marx himself though, as Lyotard writes.
We must come to take Marx as if he were a writer, take his text as a madness and not as a theory, stroking his beard without contempt and without devotion.
All forms of signification or representation, every instance of a great zero, be it Marxian or Freudian, necessarily fails to capture everything. They create plays of desire, nothing more, nothing less. It's important to note that Lyotard isn't saying to hell with meta-narratives here. Rather, he's simply acknowledging that they are never truly accurate. They always fall short. With this in mind, we can get into the specifics of his analysis of Marxism. In my eyes, it is best encapsulated in a separation of Marx into the figure of a little girl and the great prosecutor.
The little girl Marx, offended by the perversity of the polymorphous body of capital, requires a great love. The great prosecutor Karl Marx assigned the task of the prosecution of the perverts and the invention of a suitable lover, the proletariat, sets himself to study the file of the accused capitalist.
What he means here by love is undoubtedly what Freud refers to as the genital, a quasi-mythical state of sexual development where all the patchwork partial drives fuse into one. For Lyotard, this is impossible due to the necessary fragmented and fragmentary nature of the libidinal band. When it comes to Marxism, this is all closely tied to what Lyotard terms the organic body of authentic production. Essentially, Marx insinuates that, prior to the influence of capitalism, there's some sort of perfect unity of a social body. Under this unity, in a way much akin to genital love for Freud, desire is posited to be healthy. It circulates in a useful, non-exploitative fashion. However, this organic body is polluted or sickened by capitalism, in particular by what Lyotard terms prostitution. Quoting a footnote to Marx's 1844 manuscripts,
prostitution is only the specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer.
More than simply literal sex work, this for Lyotard corresponds to a sort of quote-unquote perversion of desire, where libido is released by non-useful expenditure. For Marx, through his prostitution, the healthy organic body is smashed to pieces, breaking it into a patchwork of partial drives. Immediately, this should set off some warning bells. To begin with, it seems to reverse the relationship between the bar and the band. Like we saw in the last section, organic bodies aren't truly real, if I can use that word. Rather, they are only the result of certain narratives or dispositifs, performing specific roles in the libidinal theatre. It's not genital love that comes first and then gets perverted, but rather the other way around. On another level, though, the view of prostitution or perversion as some sort of terrible thing should raise some eyebrows. As Lyotard himself says,
Prostitution is the political aspect of dependency, but it also has a libidinal position besides. This is what Sade overlooked.
At the end of the day, perversion, as we underlined in the first section of this video, is the basic fact of the libidinal band. It's only through the imposition of secondary processes on the primary ones, with their inhibition and repression, that so-called normal sexuality or libidinal cathexis is developed. In Lyotard's work, there's essentially a celebration of prostitution. Not because it's exploitative, not at all, but rather because it represents a liberation of libido from the predefined circus imposed on it by the slowing of the bar. When it comes to the organic body of authentic production, in Lyotard's words,
the unification of Marx's body, which requires that the polymorphous perversity of capital be put to death for the benefit of the fulfillment of the desire for genital love, is not possible.
Here again, we see the relationship between mythical genital love, Marx's organic body, and polymorphous perversity. To summarize, I feel that a diagram may be useful. Here, the Great Zero takes the form of authentic production, creating the fantasy of an organic body that is sickened by the influence of libidinal band through the perversion of prostitution. Not necessarily sex work, but more generally any sort of non-utilitarian expenditure of libido. With this in mind, we can turn to another aspect of Lyotard's analysis of Marxism, what he sees as its failure to recognize in capitalism a system of jouissance. Although Lacan uses the same term, jouissance in this case doesn't simply refer to pleasure in its extreme form, but rather the enjoyment of libido or desire as such. As Lyotard says,
we must grasp the fact that the system of capital is not the site of the occultation of an alleged use value, which would be anterior to it, but that it is, in itself, libidinal.
When it comes to Marx, Lyotard accuses him of illegitimately denying that jouissance can exist under capitalism. Instead, he says, Marx suggests that it's only through the genital love which defines the organic body of authentic production that gratification can occur. In Lyotard's eyes, this is completely mistaken. Going back to what we were just discussing, Lyotard sees it as a form of generalized prostitution and thus perversion. As such, it's filled with intensities, demonstrated by this diagram. However, this isn't to say that capitalism as a system is any closer to the libidinal band than Marx's theatre. As Lyotard states,
The question of jouissance is, however, exposed by currency come alive, a body of intensities. This currency seems to lend itself to jouissance, but it cannot but defer it.
It's on this note that I'd like to end this section, moving into Lyotard's analysis of capitalism. So far, we've seen how Marxism acts as a dispositif that follows the libidinal band to create the fantasy of an organic body based on authentic production. However, this isn't something unique to communism. Rather, Lyotard maintains, capitalism acts the exact same way. In his eyes, as we'll soon see, it's a system of duplicity, even if it's still filled with intensity. At the root of the issue is the same thing that makes Marxism problematic.
Such is the religion included in political economy. It postulates, like the little girl Marx's critique, the organic unity of the body of capital and believes in it.
Essentially, just like Marx's critique, capitalism is built upon the fantasy of an organic body. John's love for the capitalist amounts to well-regulated growth. That's to say, a form of economic growth that's both reliable and predictable. However, as is shown in this diagram, the interference of what Lyotard calls the concentratory zero poisons it in the same fashion as prostitution in the case of Marx's body. To explain, the libidinal band is always struggling up against the bar, always seeking to dissimulate dispositifs by covering them up with intensities. The concentratory zero is essentially the agent of this process, at least after the great zero has finished its work and folded the porginal skin into its theatre. It's important to note that it's a dispositif in its own right, rather than being another primary process. In fact, the concentratory zero is basically the opposite of libidinal band, trying to bind as much libido as possible into defined drive circuits developed by the process of folding. However, it paradoxically puts the whole system at risk, too much intensity threatening its stability and reheating the bar, leading to the possibility of it being put back into motion. When it comes to capitalism, we see this happening in its need for constant expansion. There's always an outside for capitalism to plunder, but the energies or libido it absorbs from that exterior has a tendency to destabilize it. For Lyotard, rather than being some sort of external limit for capitalism, which if passed would lead to its collapse, it's all internal. Just like we discussed earlier about Freud and the inner-outer distinction, capitalism does set up a distinction between the this and the not this, but it isn't really stable in any sense of a word. To quote from Libidinal Economy,
Money becomes the general equivalent for rendering the outside peoples, proportionate to the goods which they buy. Nothing other than the concentratory central zero.
the outside and its peoples are essentially food to the capitalist system, acting as sources of energy needed to maintain surplus value. As soon as they enter into it, however, that energy becomes annihilated by the law of exchange, being reduced to nothing more than representations puppeted in the theatre of a bar. It's for this reason that this section is titled Capitalism and Duplicity. To give some more context, as Lyotard says, there's always
the avant-garde of capital, the perpetual activity of pushing back its frontiers, the incorporation of yet more new pieces of the band into its system, but incorporation with a view to revenue, to yielding a return.
In this way, capitalism is not truly a system of pure intensity or jouissance, like some critics of Lyotard seems to think he implies. Rather, it's one that is fundamentally duplicitous and dissimulating, tying the introduction of more and more of a band with the imposition of stronger and stronger secondary processes. It's with this that we finish our video on Jean-François Lyotard's concept of the libidinal band. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. I know this has been quite a longer video than normal, so thank you so much for staying till the end. Next time, we'll also be doing something a little different from usual. Until then, bye!